Good morning. We are reviewing and summarizing the bigger picture in the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. And we are on page 1369 in this review. Essentially, the review began, I would say, from page 1350, even though I did go back earlier. And the primary reason we're reviewing it a second time, I'm just stating it for the record, in case people join the class later. That's something I repeat almost every day anyway, because it requires explanation. We already ended the Hemshech. So why are we going back? So number one is because the Rebbe Rashab did not finish the Hemshech. Since he didn't finish it, we're trying to piece together and see if we could figure out, based on the ideas he did begin and did explain at length, and based on source material, which we found, namely the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and the Pasuk Mikra Hashem Elokeinu Magbil Sheves Hamashpili Sheves Hamashpili Liras B'Shamayim Ba'aretz, and we learned that at length over several months. So now we're coming back and seeing, based on all that, how that it can inform us and help us piece together the puzzle of, number one, understanding better the entire context of the Ayin Beis, of the Hemshech, especially the conclusion, the last 150 pages, I would say, 100 and be exact, from 1350 till 1474, I think it is, 1478 rather. So around, something like 150 pages, 100 and, what would that be? 1350 to 1400 and 1450, yeah, around 120 pages. And secondly, in addition to the general context, to be able to come and see what themes were not finished, what questions were not answered, and attempt to do that as well, which, of course, is a somewhat of a, I don't say bold, but somewhat of a pioneering attempt, if you wish, because no one's ever done that before. And hopefully it can be a contribution to the learning of Ayin Beis and understanding it, especially, as I said, the Rebbe Rashab not concluding it, how it would have been put together. Some of it we're going to have to, I don't say guess, I think it's an intelligent guess. Some of it we can't know fully what the Rebbe Rashab would have actually written, but there's definitely things for sure that he would have developed because they are stated clearly in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So we're standing on strong foundations, because worst scenario is that is the Mittler Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe are saying it. But the Rebbe Rashab would have clearly elaborated on it and ultimately reconnected to the central themes and all the way back to the beginning of Ayin Beis. That's going to be a little more, I would say, a little more speculative, if you wish, a little more extrapolation necessary, because that's not based directly on those Maimorim. It's based more on the logical connection after we understand what he's saying here. Now, this will all become clear as we go along. As we go along, I've been pointing out again and again points that are part of this bigger picture. So with that said, I do want to go back for a moment, because we're right now in pretty much a very dense piece, relatively speaking, dense, Kabbalistically, and very technical in many ways. So I want to step back a moment before we go back and learn inside, that I think it will help tremendously understanding the general context. So let's always keep in mind, it's always important to know the Nekuda Sachachma, the Nekuda of all Hemshech Ayin Beis, is the interface between God and existence, between the divine and existence. More specifically, the interface between the divine within that manifests and relates to existence and the divine beyond existence. And to do that, obviously, just by saying that, you realize there's three levels. There's the divine that relates to existence. Sometimes you can refer to as Elokim, like when we say V'yadaita Hayoim, which is a very important verse that's used by almost half of Ayin Beis, elaborates on that verse, the second half, that is. V'yadaita Hayoim v'shavis ki havayu hu Elokim b'shamayim mimal v'ha'oretz mitochas ein oid. Then there's the divine beyond existence. In this verse, it would be like Havaya, in contrast to Elokim. And then, of course, there's the third level that connects the two. Like we learned at the end of Hemshech Ayin Beis, the yichud of the yichud Ilah and yichud Tata, the yichud of Das Elyon and Das Tacht. So it's very hard to sum up 1,700 pages in one paragraph, but in many ways, the central theme of Ayin Beis is this interface. Keser is a very critical piece. That's why the whole Hemshel begins with Keser. And I'm convinced that had the Rebbe Rashab concluded, it would have concluded with Keser, which we'll get back to, of course, when we conclude this review and this summary. So if that's the general theme, then everything he's explaining is ultimately coming to explain that bigger theme. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with, as I said, over 1,700 pages, there's going to be so many subplots and subthemes and details, but you never want to lose sight of the bigger picture, which is critical, and that's a very big part of how I teach this, to always keep in mind the small picture informed by the bigger picture. With that said, as we've discussed a number of times, especially closer to the beginning of volume 2, Rebbe Rashab laid out that there's the end of volume 1, I should say, but then in volume 2 it develops further, that in this interface there's two general approaches. Mutable, lifting up Elokai HaMelech, which is the divine as it relates to Elokim, and Melech, Malchus, that relates to existence, lifting it up to Aramimcha, Reimamus always refers to Keser. So in that context, Mutable, which is primarily the Avodas HaTfilah, I say primarily because it's not exclusively that. In Torah, you also have Mutable, as we've discussed, and there's plenty of overlap. And then that concludes in page 1349. And 1350, which is where we began the primary summary here, begins. And now let's go back to the Hamshacha Mamayla Lamata, which is Torah. And this is bringing out of Mimcha, the language earlier in the Hemshech, even though the Rebbe Rashab does not refer to that language in volume 3, but in volume 2 he does earlier. So this is bringing Reimamus of Keser, meaning looking at things from God's eyes, not through our eyes, through creation's eyes, and we reach to God. That's Mamata Lamayla. Mamayla Mata is we're looking through God's lens as he sees existence. Arimimcha being drawn into Elokai HaMelech. So Keser, Reimamus, this transcendent dimension being drawn into Elokai HaMelech, into the divine as it manifests in Elokai HaMelech, Koyach, as he explained much earlier in volume 2 in Hemshech Ayin Beis. Now, in this Mamayla Mata Lamayla, so now he goes into more detail of what is this Torah. Torah is the key way of bringing down Hamshacha Mamayla Mata. What is Torah? What does Torah really do? So we all know Torah is God's Torah, in which he invested, which he infused with his own very essence. I mentioned yesterday, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Anochi Anon Nafshis Ksavis Yehovis, Oisi Atem Leichim. Torah is essentially, I don't like to use the word snapshot, we'll call it CAT scan if you wish, or of God's mind and God's plan. I say not just mind, because it's where you say Chachmaseh, but it's Seinish HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Both the Chacham and the Ratzon, which is a term that's used in Tanya, especially in Tanya in chapter 5, we start speaking about Torah mitzvahs. So Chachmaseh Ritzeni, if you think about it, is actually Chachma is more in the Esesphiris, and Ritzeni is Keser. So Torah really is a combination of both. Now mitzvahs in Torah itself, mitzvahs is primarily Ratzon Hashem, because mitzvahs on their own are action. Torah is the understanding as well, but Torah also, of course, has to do with is all telling us also about mitzvahs, and mitzvahs implement what the Torah says. I'm mentioning that very deliberately because it's very much part of the theme of the Maimarim Mikra Hashem Elokeinu Ner Mitzvah Torah as well as what we've been learning here in the last few days. We actually talked yesterday and the day before about Torah mitzvahs, Galgalta and Moicha, which is the two elements that he called the Elyon, and the Pnimius of the Chitzenius of the Elyon comes down lower than the Pnimius of the Tachten, which I'll get back to when we sum it up. But let me go back to the bigger picture here. So in that sense, Torah therefore has to be understood. And we're actually right now learning about Torah. And I'll get to that in a moment as well. So the Rebbe Rashab, in order to explain it, he began with a short summary of those Maimarim Mikra Hashem Elokeinu. What is the meaning of Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam? What's a Ner? A Ner too is an interface, if you think about it. A Ner is made up of a wick, which is the divine soul as it comes down into what? Into the oil, which is the body and the animal soul. The intelligence of the animal soul is oil, with the goal of transforming it into an oir, into light, which is the flame that it creates. And in Aveda, that means that the divine soul is influencing and educating and training the animal soul, that the oil, instead of it being used as intelligence for your own survival and your own self-interest, should become fuel for what? For V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, for the fiery and passionate love of God. That's the light. So that's what a candle represents. That's what a neshama accomplishes when it comes down below. The divine soul affecting the animal soul. Then we're also given the resources called Torah and mitzvahs, or in the pasuk ner mitzvah and Torah. A ner of a mitzvah adds to that, because the mitzvah manifests in the physical world, Ratzon Elyon, taking parchment and using it for tefillin, taking wool, using it for tzitzis. Same thing with all other physical objects. So mitzvahs are an added resource. A neshama could achieve that much, but mitzvahs add a whole other dimension in elevating the animal soul and the material world to the divine. And then we get to Torah Oyer, all creates an Oyer, the neshama, the ner mitzvah, the ner neshama of the neshama, and the ner of the mitzvah create an Oyer, which is an Oyer atzmi, not just a flame, a candle like a ner is a candle. An Oyer is an Oyer atzmi, as the Rebbe Rashab called it on page 1352, which is a much higher level of Oyer, because it's not an Oyer that is coming down relative to existence. Because remember, a neshama comes down and manifests within a body and within the animal soul. A mitzvah comes down and manifests within the physical world. Torah retains its divine purity, so to speak. So though a neshama also retains it, but it's concealed, more concealed. A mitzvah, it's also concealed, because you just have the actual action. Torah has gili in it. Torah is understanding God, learning Torah, like you used the expression we learned yesterday. You said, limud yediyas Torah is yediyah. It's not just action-based. It's not just maaseh. It's filled with a whole experience. When you're learning Torah, you're experiencing God, and you're coming to understand God and coming to feel. Because remember, the goal is not just to follow God's orders, it's also to know God and to love God. V'yadaita and v'ashavesa levavecha and v'ahavta are human experiences that are beyond just action-based. It's not just a servant serving his master. Because the servant doesn't need to understand or love the master in order to serve him. You just have to follow orders. But here the relationship is far more primistic and integrated. So Torah gives us that experience. And we'll again talk about this as well as we go along. To understand that, the Rebbe Rashab says, let's begin. Nirali levayir ayin, he says on page 1352, but based on what it's explained elsewhere with Oyer Hariyah. Eyesight, vision, sight is going to be now the main focus in the next, almost till the end of the well, I would say to the end of the Hemshech, but definitely the first 100 pages for sure, where he talks about Riyah. But to do Riyah, he develops it in the whole discussion. Now, ultimately, what Riyah is going to teach us is the ultimate paradox, that on one hand, we cannot see today without an external light, so we need to have an outside light to see, but then when you see, your own eyes are seeing. So it is the ultimate Er Mekabel on one hand, because it's Mekabel, you cannot see without receiving the siyua of an outside light. And that's exactly the story with us in this world. A neshama, even armed with mitzvahs, cannot see direction in life without looking into Torah. I maybe correct myself. A neshama, without looking into Torah to know what mitzvahs to do and how to live our lives, cannot see in this world. As much as it's a chelik elekam mal mamish, and a divine soul, but once it comes down below, as we shall learn later more at length, it gets concealed. So for neshama in this world, that doesn't mean a soul would not have natural instincts to connect to God, because it is at the end of the day, like he says in Tanya, it's like a flame, and it has the ava mesuteres, the natural love, and push comes to shove, a neshama is going to gravitate, is going to be drawn to its source. But that's either in a time of danger or emergency, as the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 18, 19 in Tanya. But regardless, a soul needs to be just like a pilot flame needs to be fanned, needs to be cultivated. So what gives the neshama direction in this world? Torah Oyer. You learn Torah. Torah tells you this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. A neshama instinctively does not know that because God conceals that from the neshama. Like the body tells you when you're hungry. Your soul doesn't tell you what kind of spirituality you need in your life. It may tell you you're hungry, but it doesn't tell you the details. Your body gravitates naturally to physicality because that's how it is after the tzimtzum. That's how God created existence. So we need On the other hand, it's the neshama itself, the guf, that's going to experience God. It's not the Torah, it's not the light that's experienced. The light is just there to illuminate the room. But who activates, who actualizes and creates a dir b'tachtenim, it's not the light. The light is just showing us the God. It's like saying, like a car driving in the dark. It's not the lights, the headlights that drives the car. The headlights show you what way to go, but the car has to drive. So the same thing here, that we're going to learn that the eye itself ends up seeing. Now to understand the eye, the eyesight, he goes and then says, this is Mutable, and there's other two aspects of Mutable. The levana, the moonlight, and a luminous glowing stone. And there you have the three levels of Mutable. And as I explain, and I'm going to further explain as we go along, these are three ways how a Mutable begins to grow and develop and receive the light, absorb it until it becomes something of its own. Eyesight is going to be the ultimate example because that's the main example, the main example the Rebbe Rashab wants to. But the moon and the glowing stone are all going to be very critical in understanding the whole Mutable, including what eyesight is like. First of all, by contrast, and also because these are all stages in the growth of Aliyas HaMalchus, if you wish, and Malchus is the ultimate Mutable. So whatever we call Mutable in simple English, in the spherotic structure, that's Malchus. So if you just, every time you hear Malchus, just think of it as that's in the 10 spheres, the last sphere is always the Mutable. That'll help you understand and somewhat decipher that word Malchus, which still remains always a word of a sphere, and we don't really, Malchus is usually, we think of kingship as a king, but really it's this midah, what he calls the Mutable. And within it, there's the three levels. Now, just in general, Levana, in Chassidus in general, Levana is usually the main Mutable. Whenever you hear about the moon, about Malchus, you hear about the moon. Just like Malchus has nothing of its own, the moon has no light of its own. So the moon is generally the bigger picture. Here, interestingly, Hariyah is going to be even more critical in understanding this whole interface. But that doesn't diminish, no pun intended, the role of the moon. As a matter of fact, in the beginning of Ayin Beis, you'll see, beginning of volume 3 of Ayin Beis, he speaks about Levana extensively. That is the Levana that goes through all the stages. First, the Levana is like a new moon and completely invisible. Then it grows and it waxes till it becomes a full moon. And there he explains the 7 levels in Eitz Chaim of Aliyas HaMalchus, Aliyas HaLevana, as it relates to the sun till it becomes side by side. Like we looked at Biti, Achesi, and Imi. First it's a daughter, it's a Mutable, then it's like Achesi equal, and then it's Imi, it's a Mashpia into Zah, into the sun. Zah, if Malchus is Mutable, Zah always see as Mashpia, as we discussed. So basically, moving the language from Mutable to Mashpia is what he's saying here, Malchus and Zah. So there's the levels of, so Levana is a critical part of it, but we'll discuss this also later as we get back to these 3 different levels of Mutable, the moon, the glowing stone, and the eyesight. But basically, keep in mind that it's really the eye is the primary thing that he's going to get back to, but the moon is also going to be understood in this way. Like the moon at the end of the day does not see. That's the difference. The eye itself sees. And yet the moon itself, we're going to learn how the moon becomes like the sun and even greater than the sun. So the same idea of a Mutable elevating is going to be understood in, and I don't know about the stone, but definitely with the eye for sure, and also with the moon. But we'll talk about the difference between the moon and the eye later on. I just didn't want to ignore it, just make that point. Now, getting back to Torah.
The sun is also not seen. The sun is not seen. Something by the eye does even more than the sun.
That's not for discussion right now. The sun is a mashpia and the eye is a Mutable. So we're not comparing right now. But it does say, Veinenu me'ires kishemesh kiyireach. Right? So there's the eye will see like the sun and the moon. As I said, we'll get back to that. I don't want to go into the details right now. The I will be even higher than the sun. Let's put it that way, ultimately. So bottom line is that, we'll get back to my train of thought, Torah. Okay, so in these three levels of Mutable, he says these are the three levels of Mikra, Mishna, and Talmud, which correspond to well, we'll go from the top down. Talmud is in Bria, Mishna is in Yetzirah, and Mikra is in Asiyah. In the Spheres is the other way around. Mikra is in Chabad, Mishna is in Chagas of Atzilus, and Talmud is Nihi. So you could say he's very much explaining how to reconcile that. And we're already deep in the middle of that discussion. But before I go back to the details, I want to still stick to the bigger picture here. So we've talked a lot about now Mikra, Mishna, and Talmud. Now, what is it in the context of the bigger Hemshech of Ayin Beis? So let me say this. I've said this already, but I think it was brief. I'll elaborate a little more right now. Key thing to keep in mind is this. Since Torah is Torah, that means Torah is here, talk about interface, to serve as an interface, to serve as a light that shines and guides and directs us. It also empowers us. So clearly in Torah, we're going to need to have a bunch of elements that help us in this journey. So if the Torah was completely a purely divine entity as it is in the highest levels, what we call Shashuyim Lefanov, it's God's delights. Chassidus explains that that's the highest levels, all the way how Torah, part of all one with godliness. That's how the king is in his most inner sanctum. Torah is there with him. Meaning Torah is his nursling, is the way it's translated. Meaning that Torah was basically cultivated like God's closest child that's always with him. So if you talk about Torah on that level, we have a tremendously high level, but there's an issue. We want the Torah to help us down on earth. Like we say, Torah le b'shamayim. That God did not want Torah just kept by himself, or even in the heaven. And that was the whole debate, that the angels wanted the Torah for them. And Hashem said, no. Moshe explained that Torah le b'shamayim, the whole Torah is to come down, to come into a world of Mitzrayim, Yiradatem, a world of Leisignev, Leisitzach, a world that has challenges. In heaven, there is no challenge. Nobody wants to steal. Nobody wants to kill. So the Torah is meant to come down, like he says in Tanya, Nishtal Shalah, many, many levels, as the Torah evolves and comes down into this world in order, and by Matan Torah, 26 generations after creation, Hashem actually gives the Torah, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. He gives the Torah to the people, the Jewish people, and ever since, Torah is empowering us to transform this world. That's what Matan Torah was about, to change the chefze, the very physicality of this existence, and make it a mishkin l'Hashem, v'shachanti b'seichem adira b'tachtenu. So there clearly means that Torah has to relate to us, and we have to relate to Torah. But Torah is still mamayla lamata. No matter what, Torah always remains essentially something that's coming from above. That's why we say God gives us the Torah. Neisan ha-Torah. Torah is not initiated by us. That doesn't mean there's no Aveda Mamat Lamayla. We have to struggle and learn Torah and study Torah, which like we're doing right now. This is a Mamat Lamayla, but it's an Mamat Lamayla in something that was given to us. When you say davening, for example, even though the mitzvah of davening is given to us, but davening is eventually completely generated by the one who's praying. As a matter of fact, Al-Pi Daraisa, feel is only when you have a need. Your need, Tzarchei Adam, a person has a need, they pray. Then Chazal added other prayers and so on. So prayer is essentially generated by us and our needs. So yes, God gave us the gift of prayer, so to speak. But it's not like Torah. Torah is giving us direction and guidance, and actually all the mitzvahs and so on. We could not come up with those mitzvahs. We're not talking about the few mitzvahs that we could morally have figured out with our own minds. Even those mitzvahs are also given to us from above. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that Torah remains completely removed from us. Because in every interface, the Torah itself does manifest in a way that we can relate to. So in that sense, you could explain that in general, The three levels of Mikra, Mishna, and Talmud are three ways that Torah communicates with us. Mikra, and I'm speaking now in we call it Chassidus applied language, if you wish. What we've learned, Mikra is essentially a snapshot, literally a snapshot of what God wants of us. But it's completely only action-based. It's in story form, and it's action, doesn't give us details, and it doesn't give us understanding explanation, like he explained. And what's the reason that Mikra is an Asiya? So therefore, it comes down into Asiya. It comes into a way that you can talk, you can read a verse. Every person is equally capable of reading a verse. We say even Mishna, even someone who doesn't understand it can still read it. Ben Chomesh Mikra, even a 5-year-old child, because it's not required, it doesn't require any Giluyim, because it's not a world of Giluyim. Mikra is simply like an Atzmi of Chabad in Atzilus, in its purest form, like so to speak, given to us in a concentrated experience only as a Meiser. So essentially, it's not subject to any of the Hishtalshlus and the Tzimtzumim and the diminishments of Hishtalshlus, because God is giving us, is only that, however, the snapshot is only of, just 1 second, please. Okay, so basically, it's essentially giving us a picture of what Hashem wants. That's Mikra. Why is that so vital? Because it's not diluted, even though we may not fully understand it, it's not diluted, but it's giving us an Atzmi in this world. What it's missing is it's not on our terms. We don't understand the details, and we don't understand and we don't know the reasons behind it, nor the explanation. So then comes step 2, is Mishna. Mishna is not Atzmi like Chabad, it's Chagas. Chagas, by definition, is already the divine that has come down and relates to existence, like he said. Chagas is, he says, Midas, Shaychus el Elmas. They already have a relationship with existence. That's what Chagas is. So since they have a relationship with existence, now you don't need it to be so-called come down into an Asiya level. It itself can be revealed. And that's why in Mishnah you find that it comes into Yitzira. Yitzira is a world of Gilui, Oris and Kalim. There's concealment relative to Bria and Atzilus, but relative to Asiya, you have now, as he says in Mishnah, all the details are explained, and it tells us exactly what is kosher, what's not kosher, what makes something a carbon that you can elevate. So basically, it manifests in a more revealed way the divine. So even though Mikra, it's all based on Mikra, because Mikra is the written Torah, and everything is there, but now it's becoming revealed in the reveal, so it's becoming more integrated. So Mishnah's role as Torah Shabbat, as the first step in Torah Shabbat Peh, is to manifest it on our terms. So Mikra gives us more, you could say, a taste of God on God's terms. It's still a Torah given to us, and we could read it and we could understand Pshat, and there's certain basic things we can relate to. But really on our terms, Mishna is what really begins to internalize it. So there you see in Torah itself, even though Torah remains a Mamayla Lamata experience, in Torah itself, here we've already talked about 2 levels. We're going to talk about Talmud later. But there's a second level where Torah is identifying, relating to us in more specifics, and that's what Mishnah is all about. It's interpreting and explaining what it says in the pasuk in a way that we can make it, in a way that we can actually implement it. Where it says in the Mikra, will just say, put on tefillin, but it doesn't tell you where and how and when and so on. The Mishnah will tell you that. The same thing with Sukkah, the same thing with all the other mitzvahs. In the language of the sporadic structure, you can call it the Kabbalistic structure. Mikra, as I said, Chabad. So it's Chabad and Seichel, that's l'mayla ma'hasoga. because Ayin Temotze, it's manifesting the superconscious of the divine. And that's why the only place to express itself is in Asiyah. It comes from a place that's higher than Gilui. It's Torah as it's higher than Gilui. Since it's higher than Gilui, it can't manifest in Gilui. It manifests in, as I said, stories and action without the details. Mishna comes from Chagas. Chagas is emotions. Emotions are already defining a relationship. A relationship means there's something commensurate between the two people who are having a relationship, even if you're talking about the divine. So Chagas is relating to existence. Now, in explaining that, what we learned yesterday, I want to explain it again in the bigger picture context, and then we'll go back to actually summarize what we actually learned. So briefly, he brought the Zohar on page 1368 that says Mishna is the wife of the Ahu Nar, the level called Nar, of the young one. The is Shifcha de Shchinta, the maidservant of Shchina. Very cryptic. He's going to explain it. That's what we're in the middle of explaining. To explain it, he says, let's contrast Nar and Zokan. Because what's the opposite of a Nar? It's a Zokan. A Zokan is a sage. So we learned yesterday in detail what the Zokan is about. The level of Atik, and generally Keser, as Atik manifests in Ar Champin. And he explained Zokan from the word, Atik from the word Zokan as the aged one, which means one that has been here from the beginning. So there's someone that's not mechudesh, like not a newcomer, not a chiddush, something that God chose to create, but something that was there, so to speak, from the beginning, manifesting the very etzem. The second point in Atik, he said, is actually from the word age, like aged and experienced. He said the word zoken mechudesh. Let me just see the language that he actually used. Hagadlos, maturity. The melubas bein the state of maturity because it manifests tachtena shebemaitzil. Okay, and then finally he explained that it's a place of gadlos hameichin that's higher than shinui. When you see a person who's aged, who has a maturity about them, they're not subject to be affected by and get excited by emotional outbursts or emotional ups and downs, because they're miyushiv. They're settled in. What do we call it? A conviction, a certain intelligent conviction that they have achieved and arrived at, even in a human level, as opposed to a young person who, if you disagree with them, like he said, if you disagree with a young person, he's capable of getting very excited and unable to contain, unable to tolerate something that opposes his mind or his will. Certain impatience, if you wish. But a Zokan is not subject to that. Now, what is the meaning about this in a deeper level? So let's explain. Remember, the interface between the divine and existence is two extreme opposites, right? It's diametric opposites. Because the divine in every possible way has nothing to do with existence. It's a creator beyond the creator, not just infinite, beyond infinite. We, on the other hand, are mortals. We are defined by structure and parameters. In a certain way, you could say, using the language a bit here, that the Eibishter, in his highest levels, is Leishanisi. He's immutable, unwavering. We say immutable, unchanging. We are changing creatures all the time. Our situations change, our circumstances change, and even our own personalities, our moods. In other words, we live in a world of shinui. We live in a world of shinui, of change and constant change. Everything changes. Time and space, by definition, time especially, is all about shinui. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, the past, the present, the future. It's constantly moving. The world is a shifting world all the time. That's not a bad thing. It's the way the world was created. The Eibishter is completely beyond shinui. So in a way, you can say the ultimate interface is, can we bring God's immutability, that eternity of the divine, into a world of shinui? That despite the changes we go through, all the changes should all be permeated with one constant, what we call sometimes a singularity. And that's the ultimate goal. And the answer is absolutely. That is the meaning of Dira b'Tachtenim. Tachtenim is all about shinuyim. constant changes. Dirle is barach atzmus is lamayla machine. So in a way, when we go into this world with all the changes, and we bring Torah into the world, and we say no matter whether it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, there's always a God in our lives, and there's always mitzvahs to be done. Yes, the mitzvahs, some of them are definitely associated with time. There are mitzvahs connected to Shabbos, mitzvahs connected to Sunday, and there are different mitzvahs to different Yomim Tevim. But overall, it's bringing Ratzon Elyon that's higher than Shinui into an existence of Shinui. We're essentially doing that ultimate interface. To put it in simpler terms, if you live if you live your life in this world completely based on the terms of nature, your life would basically be one constant change. Yeah, you may have certain things in your life like constants, like the people you love, the home you build, your work. I mean, but at the end of the day, we all know they're all subject to changes. So the truth is, love indeed is a divine thing. So that's why that has an element of no change. But essentially, it's like being on a sea and an ocean, and just the waves carry us. Torah is a constant that gives us the moorings and the anchors and the bearings that turn a life filled with vicissitudes and ups and downs into a consistent one driven by a mission, that the soul came down to this world to fulfill what God wants of it. Yes, it has many details and many changing elements and moving parts, but it's all about one mission, to make a dira b'tachtenim in your corner of the world. So therefore, Torah has in it both aspects. On one hand, there's the Torah as it's higher than Shinui. In a way, you could say that's like Mikra. We'll get to that more as we discuss this later. He doesn't say it explicitly. And then there's Torah as it manifests in Chesed and Gvura, in Mides, Chagas, not Chabad, but Chagas, that is about Shinuyim. Not that the Torah, not that God forbid, suddenly is not, Ani Hashem Leishanisi is always a fact, but the Leishanisi now manifests in what is kosher, what's not kosher, what is mutter, what is usr. The details that the Mishnah lays out, as we're going to discuss, that it does manifest itself in a world of Shinuyim. So when two people have a disagreement, like look at the Mishnayos. You have a Shnai Me'echzim Betalis. Two people we'll start with the most classic Mishnah. Shnai Me'echzim Betalis. Two people come and they say they're both holding the same garment, the talis. And this one says, Kuli Shali. It's mine. And this one says, Kuli Shali. It's mine. What do you do? That's only shaykh in a world of Shinuyim. In a world where there can be disagreements, where there could be duplicity, there can be lies, because they both can't be saying the truth. So the Torah clarifies, the Mishnah clarifies what to do. There you have an immutable Torah speaking to a mutable world. You're speaking a world of Torah that's higher than Shinui, speaking to a world of Shinuyim and a world of changes, a world of ups and downs, a world of even of disagreements of right and wrong, and telling us how to clarify birur. Yeah, remember the word birur, clarity, separation, a birur in a world that needs birur. Lamaila, you don't need birur. If eyes of God in Atzilus and higher, everything is clear. Birur is only needed when something is not clear. When there's a disagreement, or one person is lying, one person, Reuven is saying this, Shimon is saying that. So that's like where Torah Sheba'al Peh comes into, and namely Mishnah, to engage itself with a world of such shinuyim, and to bring the clarity of Torah's emes into a world which not always is emes, alma de shikra, even a world that lies and is deceptive. So in that sense, so Mishnah is engaged with that. So Mishnah, as we're going to be learning, is connected to the level of Nar. Nar is a world of shinuyim, of ispilus, of midas. That's why Mishnah is rooted in Chagas, and it manifests the Yitzhira. Mikra, there's no room. Mikra, you don't have that. Now, again, he doesn't say so explicitly. Maybe soon he'll say it. I don't remember if we learn. We'll see. We'll see inside whether he's going to compare Mikra to Zaken and Mishnah to Nar. But clearly, Mishnah is definitely Nar. And now we see how it connects to the bigger theme of interface between a divine, immutable divine, a Leisha Nisi, into a world of where there are Shinuyim and Midas, as we're going to learn now in the next paragraph. Well, I did a long summary today. We'll learn something. So yesterday, as I said, we discussed Zaken Atik in this context, And that's the meaning of the Zohar. I'll just continue some where he says, Idra Rabba, Saba Datu is Sosim. His das is Sosim. It's like sealed. What means das that's sealed? So he explains this. Das Tachten is not sealed. Das Tachten is Maftecha de Kol Shis. It's the key that opens up the door to the 6 midas, as he explained on top of page 1369. Kashadasu sheyeda mashiach seneged shebechin sidiyas lapsha shenegeya dov v'hayim espol b'midas. Avur bechinas psicha mahadas b'midas. So that's where das opens up a door like a key to the midas, because shaykh is a midas. That's mashenkem bechinas. He calls it primius hamidas. Mashenkem bechinas gadlus hadas zokin she'em is a spilus b'midas shebelev v'hi bechinas das elyon. That's das elyon. So that's daituyus sosim, he says. V'zeu daituyus sosim she'ena nimshach b'midas, lisis spilus b'midas. That's how das remains removed. Now, in our experiences, and this is where it really becomes so fascinating, is that all this that's spoken about in the higher spheres also manifests in our own experience. When we say a zaken and a nar, even though a zaken on earth is still a human being, you can't compare a zaken mam, a physical human being, to atik, but you could see the difference between an immature person and a mature person. You know, like I mentioned yesterday, when you're sitting and having a discussion, say we have to go to a sage. Let's go to someone that's daituyis sosim, that's experienced, that's been around, not a newcomer. What are you essentially saying? That in our lives, we have somebody that is more sage-like and has that type of composure and maturity that you can go to and consult with and get and get a completely different perspective. So in other words, in our lives itself, we have the difference in midas and moichin is essentially this. Midas is meant to be a world of change. That's what a midah is. Love, reverence, these are not static states. These are states that are aroused, stimulated, something you love more, you love less, or something's the other way around, more gvura. So midas by definition is the world of changes that we are so much, the human being is so much part of that. It's essentially, most of our lives are controlled by our midas. But we also were blessed with moichin. Moichin at its best, at its healthiest, creates a certain reflective stability. Moichin is meant to temper and tame the midas. So true midas is where we live out our lives. And we're not talking about necessarily tempering our passions, our good ones, but moichin is to create balance. Balance, not just balance, but also to make sure that the emotions don't get the better of you. Moich shalat al alev. So moichin, by definition, in its purest form, obviously by a zaken, it's in the most mature state. But even by all of us, as we mature and grow, essentially moichin and midas is like the world of shinuyim and the world of lamayla mishinui. Moich should not be subject to change. Now, when I say not so, it doesn't mean your mind doesn't grow. It doesn't mean you don't grow in knowledge. But the experience of moichin is much more one of, let's reflect. Let's not be caught up right now in the subjective impulses or reflexes of our emotions. It's like when you see people are very passionate about something. They're arguing. A good argument, let's say. And then they say, let's go back and settle down here. And let's settle is a good word here as well. In miyushiv, seichel miyushiv, and let's use our minds and not get caught up in the passionate moment. That doesn't mean that the seichel shouldn't inform and shouldn't translate it into emotions. But in general, seichel is more of a lamayla mishinui in general terms. Not completely. It's just, however, it's an experience in our own lives where moichin and midas are like these two levels that he's calling here zaken and not. And you want, of course, them to communicate together. I've always, in my mind, I've always dreamed of the idea, could we ever bring together the energy and the passion and the idealism of a young person and the wisdom and serenity and seasoning of an older person? You know, like they say, youth is wasted on the young. The youthful person has all that energy and exuberance and to take on the world and free abandon. You get older, you become much more careful, more cautious. You're more calculated, if you wish. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but could you bring these two together? That's the ultimate goal. But the point I'm making here, regardless, is the issue of shinui and lamayla mishinui. So then he concludes by saying that Torah Sosim, And that's why Kesed is called Zokin. Kesed is removed from the being affected by the spilus. As we discussed yesterday, this doesn't mean God doesn't care about our Veda, but that's because he chooses to, not because he needs to. Meaning he's not part of us. It's not like someone that's commensurate and proportionate to you, so you have something where you have a relationship that has ups and downs. There's no ispilus, but that doesn't mean it's not negeya. So there's no ispilus b'shinim and ma'aser tachtenim, and nevertheless, kiyama mitzvah says nimshach from keser, from primus, like we learned earlier as well, the bottom of the previous page. And he's going to explain this later on page 1487 and on, as I pointed out, the issue of ma'aser tachtenim. I don't want to go into so much in detail here because it's going to be discussed much longer. That the fact of the matter is, since the divine midas is engaged with existence, so there you have a level where there is a spilus from our maisim. But he's going to explain there that even midas and atzilus don't have a spilus. It's mainly in malchus. But moichin for sure, and higher than moichin for sure, are l'mayla keser, like he says, is l'mayla mispilus, which is essentially meaning that even though the zaken cares, like I said, a zaken cares about his grandchildren and will love and embrace them, but it's not quite the same as children loving each other, where they're more engaged with each other on a much more emotional and more commensurate level. But that's just an example. It's not a perfect example, because the fact of the matter is no grandfather or grandmother does not get excited to see their children and grandchildren, but it's just an example relative to what we're discussing here. So that's somewhat of a long summary. I see I used most of the class today on the summary, but I think it was worthwhile just to put things into broader context. And I hope it was helpful to everybody here. It's just feeling when we're learning this, it gets so dense with the language, that the technical language, and I know being that if we're not accustomed to language, it's not easy to just read and immediately apply it to Chassidus applied in a practical way. So I felt it's important to put it into that general context. And then when we read this, it becomes easier to translate. But at the end of the day, that's what you need to do. You take these words, these called code words, malchus, zah, zokin, nar, and these type of words, shinuyim, lamayla mashinui, and translate that into terms that we can relate to, then all this comes alive in a far more relevant, and especially in the broader context of the themes of Ayin Beis. Being that we have a few more minutes, I was going to start the next paragraph, but I'm sure maybe some of you have some questions or comments. I'm happy to take anything here. And so I said a lot here, a lot more to be said. So I will elaborate on a lot of points that I've made here, but I just wanted to get it out of the system. And here we are. Okay. Floor is yours. I did a lot of talking now. Anybody? No questions? Okay. Does that mean everybody understands what I said, or everybody doesn't understand what I said? Okay.
Well, for those of us who, have been in your class for a while, this is more what you said is extremely helpful and very eloquent, but also it's a review. So hopefully it resonates if, for those of us that have been in the class for, several years.
No, thank you. That's good. I just, sometimes we need the validation here.
Yeah. No, it really helped integrate everything that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Now, as we continue learning, we're going to see how Mikra, Mishna, and then Talmud are all going to explain what I said now. I don't think the first time we learned that, I don't think I myself even came to this appreciation. I'm seeing it now, second time around, and especially after all that we've discussed, how Mikra, Mishna, Talmud are actually three levels of experiencing the divine through Torah in our lives. And I think that's going to explain a lot of stuff. Mikra, because, I was convinced that the Alter Rebbe Rashab is not going on a tangent here, that the Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud is not just an introduction to understand Riyah and Levana and the luminous glowing stone, but it itself is negated to the Havana of what Torah does in the Amshachim Amay Lamata, in the interface. I think I may have said it, but now I think it's much clearer to me. Just
I have a,
just pointing it out. And I think, as I said, we didn't finish it yet. We're far from finished. And I think now, once we said this, I think we're going to have a very clear understanding why God actually structured the Torah with a Mikra, Mishna, and a Talmud, and each one captures a different aspect. Yeah, very good, very interesting. And that's going to help us understand. Because remember, I want to say one more thing. I know you have a question. 1 second. Talmud is going to correspond to the moon in Bria. A Mishnah is going to correspond with a luminous stone, but he never actually spells out that Mikra is Malchus Asiya is going to correspond to eyesight. But that seems to be by process of elimination. It has to be that way. Now, maybe he would have said it later had he continued the Hemshech. But it's interesting because I think that is going to be a key to understanding both those three levels of Makabel, as well as what Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud is, and of course, ultimately, Hariyah. Just wanted to just state that. Go ahead, yeah.
well, I mean, it's not the question, but on your last point, it seems like the notion of the eye actually seeing on its own without siwa, without assistance, is something that happens lastly, Levo, when there is this merger, if you will, this what you call integration, or the connection between the immutable and the mutable, das elyon and das tach, and that shiluv, that combination, that interface, if you will, is only happens where the eye can see in that context once that union has occurred, which is the idea of making this world the dira, and essentially revealing Atzmus, Lasi Lavo, when you have a revelation of Atzmus so that the immutable is literally visible, that's when the eye will see. When Das Elyon becomes the prevailing, it's not how to say prevailing, where Das Elyon and Das Tachton become essentially the same vision, just viewed differently, but the same reality. Isn't that how we sort of understood when the eye will actually see, as opposed to you're trying to compartmentalize it into, you said a see or mikra. Why wouldn't it be? I don't know. Well, maybe you're saying the same thing, but we'll see not just the chitzonius of mikra, but the whole revelation. I don't know. Maybe that's what you meant.
I just said that in the Hemshech, he says that Talmud and Mishnah correspond to the moon and to the luminous stone. He doesn't explicitly say that Mikra corresponds to the eye, but you have to say that because he said in the beginning that these three levels, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya, is moon, glowing, luminous stone, and the eye. That's all I said.
Oh, I see. Okay, I was reading too much into it. My question was, and truly, for your sake, for the audience, my classmates' sake, and to the extent this is viewed publicly, this is not coming to challenge, God forbid, but to anticipate how to respond to, let's say, a skeptic, because I do have conversations with friends who are skeptics, and I try to explain to them, gently, because just like you say, you start with Aleph Beis. And so now I've got the skeptic's voice, not my voice, but I hear them questioning what you say, and I try to think, how will I respond? So you said, for example, the Torah represents the immutable, and it comes down to give us a set of rules that essentially stabilizes or regulates the vicissitudes of a changing material world. This is sort of a synopsis of what you said. So the skeptic might say, so does any other religious rule set, any set of so-called moral rules, does that in one way or another. Some perhaps closer to the way Yiddishkeit does it. Some And then my response said, well, what's so special about Torah? I guess my response would be, well, those are sets of rules. You could say you could have, God forbid, a cult. They have rules too that would regulate, but it's not divine. So what distinguishes a Torah set of rules from, let's say, I don't know, human construct, is the fact that it is a fitting set of rules. It's a set of rules that is designed to make this world stabilized, if you will. Whereas the other set of rules may purport to be doing that and may seem like they're doing that, but that doesn't mean you're actually in resonance with the way God created the world. Is that a reasonable response?
I'll tell you, if it works, it's reasonable. If it, I don't, the question is if those skeptics accept that. If they don't accept it, then it's probably not it's not going to work. It may be reasonable. So let me tell you my experience. As you probably know, I also deal with a lot of skeptics in my life. And my general response to that question, I've asked that question has been asked to me, if not thousands of times, hundreds of times for sure. It's a common question. I generally take this approach. Because at the end of the day, they're going to say to you, well, how do you know that the Torah is divine and Christianity is not? How do you know the Torah is not a cult and you call something else a cult? So my general response to preempt all of that is I say, look, I'm not here to debate with you. If you find in other religions or in other moral codes a certain constant, what we just call immutable, God bless you. I'm a Jew. I grew up with Judaism. I'm sharing what the Torah says. I would suggest taste it. It's like someone saying, how do I know that your meal, you're inviting me for dinner, is such a delicious meal? I was by someone last week, I had a delicious meal. I say, great, God bless you. I'm still inviting you to my meal and enjoy it and then see what, how you feel. I stay away from debates because they're all going to end up saying, well, how do you know you're right? They think they're right. So I don't even go there because it's like an unwinnable argument. To me, ultimately, honestly, I'm a skeptic too. My skepticism tells me that if somebody doesn't want to accept something, any reasonable explanation is not going to be enough. They'll always have another comeback. So my experience has taught me, you don't try to prove that God exists. You don't try to prove that the Torah is true. What you do is, Tamu ru'u ki tov havaya. Come taste. Learn a little chassidus. Open your mind. Are you open to other ideas? That's all. That's all I would ask for. Let's be open. Let's discuss. And you yourself, you can debate the issue yourself. Do you find in Torah something that's valuable or you don't? I do, and I feel you will also, as a friend. So you stay away from that type of, let's call it mutable argument, because it's endless, ultimately. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have what to say. You could always say something. But at the end of the day, if it's a real skeptic, especially one that is not really interested ultimately in an answer, I sometimes ask the skeptic, I say, and if I give you a good answer, you're ready to embrace Torah as being the ultimate truth? They're not going to answer yes, and I don't even want them to say yes. I want it to be their own. So that's generally my approach. What you said is accurate, Yitzchak. I'm not disagreeing with that. What you said is correct. The question if it's going to work with the respective skeptic that you're talking to. If it works, then none of us will argue. Then great, you've gotten through. I find much more that experiential proof and more words from the heart enter the heart that I care. At the end of the day, I don't remember Matan Torah with my own memory that I could say I was there, even though we're told we were all there. But I do know what I've learned in Torah, and I've also read other books. At the end of the day, I know what resonates with me. But I don't know if you can really convey that always to someone, because they have to experience it themselves. It's like you may enjoy the meal, but someone else doesn't like that food, or they haven't tasted it yet. At the end of the day, without tasting it, it's very hard to really convey the truths that we so much embrace and cherish. Anyway, that's my general approach when it comes to things like this. But again, it's case by case, person by person. Is that helpful?
Very good ideas.
Yeah. So
and then you have the scenario where you have some religions like Christianity that are based on largely Shevus Mitzvos B'nai Noach, and in that sense, even though it's much more simplistic than our sets of rules, it is following a certain scheme of Das Elyon. It's perverted, it's contorted, it's twisted because they've modified it. But so then it gets even more complicated. And
the Rambam says that Christianity and Islam both help pave the way to Mashiach. They actually did take a pagan world and turned it more godly. Forgetting about perversions or no perversions, distortions or no distortions. So yes, I would not take that away at all. The Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach are given by God to all the nations of the world, and it's also a way of bringing the immutable into a mutable and ever-changing world. Absolutely. Look, we just have a class title next week. It's called, how can we why are we so divided? Can we create a more united state? Something like that. The answer is ultimately, without the foundations, unwavering foundations, no building can really stand. I think we all agree. So unwavering foundation means leishanisi. So the fact that this nation, or for that matter, any nation, accepts the self-evident truths that we are all created equal and that God and the Creator endowed us with inalienable rights, that to me is an immutable truth in a world of change. If we all embrace that and really honored that and the sanctity of every individual and their life and opinion, we would have a very different world. But you know what? A godless universe, let's put it this way, a universe without those moorings and bearings of immutable foundations is going to shake, not just shake, is going to fall apart ultimately. The divisiveness will dominate over any form of unity. So I think the immutable is also the unified, if you wish.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think it's you talked about it too when you tried to address the assassination attempt. You were saying some similar things, in a godless world or a world without immutable rules, it's chaos, and these things happen.
Yes, exactly. Anyway, I'm just seeing that. Thank you for Likutei Torah. Okay.
Yeah, it seems very applicable.
Yeah, it's a similar. Yeah, the idea is that.
Did you see it talked about
something that was posted in the Ayin Beis class? Yitzchak, in his kindness, shares with us sometimes things he finds that are related materials or source materials to things we are learning on the Ayin Beis group. Just for the record, if anybody's not on the Ayin Beis group, you just send your number to either Yitzchak or to Tzvi or to me. We'll be happy to. We have an Ayin Beis WhatsApp group where we post either source material or updates on schedules and so on. Just for the record. Okay. Anybody else?
Also, Rabbi Shira Shirim, we talked about. I mean, would you agree? I don't know if you had a chance to look it over, but that it's source material for what we just read here in Ayin Beis.
I looked at it quickly. I have to look if it's definitely similar language I saw, so probably very close. But I'll look at it more detail.
It's also
the source material for what we're learning now. Actually, I think I mentioned is the mimer of No. Another mimer which I didn't mention. Biurei Azer, the Tzemach Tzedek, Volume 2, page 623 and 624. This thing about Mishna being nar and zokim, change, not change, is it's a lot of it, actual language from that Biurei Azer. Maybe in that Biurei Azer he may refer to the Likutei Torah that you posted.
Okay, I'll take Lynette. I'll try and I want to look into it.
Okay. So anyway, so we'll stop here. It was a review of the general Ayin Beis, specifically what we're learning. So we're still in the middle. We still have to start the new paragraph on page 1369. But I'll stop the recording unless does anyone else have any question or comment in general? Anybody?
After off the line, I have a question.
Okay, so let me